India can land on the moon, but it still can't fix a pothole without 5 stamps and 3 middlemen. It's not just bureaucracy, not just poverty. It's something deeper, more invisible. A habit so old, it feels like common sense. A culture of unchallengeable hierarchy, one that protects incompetence, rewards connections, and punishes questioning. And it's not just slowing India down, it's quietly setting the stage for something far more dangerous. Today we're going to break down how this invisible force is weakening every part of the Indian system. From courts and schools to infrastructure, innovation, even justice itself. And why, if it's not confronted soon, it won't just stall India's rise, it could cause its collapse. Think about the contradiction for a second. This is a country that runs elections on a scale that no other democracy has ever attempted. Over 1 billion voters, a country with nuclear weapons, a space program that rivals NASA's precision, and a tech sector that powers half the world's back-end software. India has all the tools of a modern superpower. And yet, roads take years to finish. Courts take decades to deliver a verdict. Basic government services require a maze of connections just to function. Islands of world-class excellence surrounded by an ocean of institutional dysfunction. But why? The easy answers are tempting. Poverty, colonial legacy, overpopulation. And sure, those are real, but they don't explain why some of the sectors operate at global standards while ordinary citizens still can't get a building permit without a bribe. They don't explain why countries that started in worse positions have reformed faster. Now here's the thing that most people get wrong. They hear hierarchy and they shrug. Every country has a hierarchy. America has Wall Street billionaires. Japan has rigid corporate ranks. Britain still has a literal monarchy sitting on a golden throne. So what makes India different? It's not that hierarchy exists, it's what happens when it goes wrong. In most societies, hierarchy is accepted, but contestable. A bad boss gets fired, a corrupt official gets investigated. A failing system gets challenged by citizens, courts, unions, or the press. Authority is respected, sure, but it's also held accountable. There's a feedback loop. Power has to justify itself. In India, for thousands of years, hierarchy has operated on a fundamentally different principle. It hasn't just been a practical arrangement for organizing society, it's been treated as a moral structure, a cosmic order that should not be disturbed. And that single difference changes absolutely everything. Because when authority is respected more than competence, incompetent systems survive far longer than they should. When status is treated as destiny rather than function, entire pools of human talent go to waste. When loyalty to the inner circle is treated as the highest virtue, public institutions can never become truly impartial. When power is personal rather than institutional, law becomes negotiable. And when suffering is framed as meaningful, even deserved, endurance replaces rebellion. That's the one small thing. Not hierarchy itself, but hierarchy that cannot be questioned. Hierarchy that is treated as sacred rather than practical. And what it does to a country, quietly, over decades, over centuries, is devastating. But don't take our word for it yet. Let's trace the roots, because this isn't some recent political failure or policy mistake. This operating system has been running for over 3,000 years, and it's still running today. Around 1500 BCE, one of humanity's oldest religious texts, the Rig Veda, introduced a creation story that would shape Indian civilization for millennia to come. The Purusha Sukta described a primordial cosmic being whose body was divided to create the social order. From his mouth came the priests, from his arms the warriors, from his thighs the merchants, and from his feet the servants. Scholar Paul Muss has called this passage essentially the first constitution of India, the foundational moment when social rank stopped being a human invention up for debate and became divine architecture, cosmic truth, unchallengeable by design. And over the centuries, that cosmic ordering didn't just survive, it hardened. Genetic research led by Harvard's David Reich has shown that roughly 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, the mixing between Indian population groups dramatically slowed, and strict endogamy took hold. Communities sealed themselves off, marriage stayed within caste, bloodlines stayed separate, and the walls between social groups became not just cultural, but biological. But how deep do these walls go? Here's a number that tells the whole story. As of 2011, intercaste marriage in India sat at just 5.8%. Some more recent estimates push it to about 10%, but even that is strikingly low. In a country of over 1.4 billion people, roughly 9 out of every 10 marriages still happen within caste lines. A 2020 Pew Research survey found that 64% of Hindu respondents were still opposed to women in their community marrying outside of their caste. Thousands of years later, and the walls are still standing. And the consequences go far beyond who marries whom. Because here's what a locked-in hierarchy does to a nation. It turns the state itself into a fortress of unchallenged power. And that brings us to what might be the most visible symptom of this disease: India's legendary bureaucracy. Anthropologist Akhil Gupta spent years embedded in Indian government offices, studying how ordinary citizens interact with their own state. What he documented in his research wasn't just inefficiency or underfunding, it was something more structural, more ingrained. Paper became power, procedure became sacred, delay became the system's default setting, and the citizen became not a rights-bearing equal, but a supplicant. Someone navigating a labyrinth of signatures and stamps, fees, and middlemen just to access the most basic public services. This is the lived reality for hundreds of millions of people, waiting for permits that sit on desks for months, waiting for land transfers that take years, waiting for decisions that never come because no official wants the responsibility of making one. And the reason isn't just laziness or bureaucratic culture, it's that the system is constructed around a principle where authority is protected more fiercely than outcomes. In democratic theory, every citizen is supposed to stand as an equal before the state. Millions of Indians encounter their government through lower-level offices where unspoken hierarchy dictates what can be demanded, how loudly you can speak, and whether you're even allowed to push back at all. The result is a state that looks powerful from a distance: nuclear weapons, space missions, the world's largest democratic elections, but feels fragile and unreliable at ground level. Roads that take years to build, schools where teachers simply don't show up, inspections that never happen because the right people weren't paid. A gap between ambition and execution so wide that it defines daily life for a billion people. And if you think that's the worst of it, wait until you hear what's happening inside India's courts. Because the justice system isn't just slow, it's collapsing under its own weight. And the numbers are absolutely staggering. As of January of 2026, India has more than 54 million pending court cases. 54 million. That number has doubled in the past decade alone. More than 5.5 million of those cases have been dragging on for over 10 years. And here's a figure that should make anyone's blood run cold. Over 180,000 cases have been sitting unresolved for more than 30 years. In April of 2022, a court in the state of Bihar finally acquitted a man of murder charges after he already spent 28 years rotting in prison. The country's oldest pending case, a bank liquidation lawsuit originally filed in November of 1948, and it was only closed in early 2023. And not because it was finally resolved, because no one even bothered to show up to the hearing anymore. The World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index now ranks India 114th out of 143 countries on civil justice, and 89th on criminal justice, one of the world's largest democracies. A nation that built its identity on constitutional governance, performing worse than countries with a fraction of its resources, its population, or its ambitions. And the bleeding isn't stopping. The Indian government itself told Parliament that court pendency rose by nearly 6% in just 3 years. Pendency in the Supreme Court alone jumped over 11%. The country has only about 21 judges for every million citizens, and the US, about 150. At current disposal rates, experts estimate that it would take several hundred years to clear the existing backlog. Several hundred years. That's not a justice system, that's a monument to institutional failure. And the government's response? Well, it told Parliament that case disposal is the judiciary's problem, not theirs. But here's what nobody talks about. Delay isn't just inefficiency in India. Delay is hierarchy wearing a different mask. Those with money, connections, and status can afford to wait, hiring lawyers, filing appeals, dragging proceedings out across decades. But those without, the poor, the marginalized, the voiceless, well, they just give up. They walk away. They stop expecting justice entirely. And when citizens stop expecting justice, well, something fundamental breaks. Because that erosion of trust doesn't stay inside the courtroom. It spreads like rust through every institution, and it pushes people toward the only thing left: loyalty to the tribe. When the state fails to protect you, you turn inward. You rely on family, on caste networks, on personal connections and patronage. In India, that instinct isn't weakness. It's a survival strategy refined over generations. When public institutions are unreliable, kinship networks pick up the slack. They provide welfare, economic support, political protection. But there's a tipping point where loyalty becomes a replacement for law, and India crossed that line a long time ago. When public services become scarce or unpredictable, the rational response is to secure access through connections, through caste, faction, or favors. Over time, nepotism stops feeling like corruption. It starts feeling like a moral duty. Helping your own becomes the highest virtue, and anyone who refuses to play that game, who insists on working within the rules, gets treated as naive at best, disloyal at worst. And the result? Law becomes something that you access through networks, not rights. Officials who refuse to favor their community get punished socially. Citizens who try to work through proper channels, they get left behind. The very idea of impartiality begins to feel foreign, idealistic, and impractical. And the inequality that this produces has reached levels that would shock most people. Research from the World Inequality Lab, led by economists including Thomas Piketty, found that by 2022 and 2023, India's top 1% controlled 22.6% of the national income and a staggering 40.1% of the nation's total wealth. Those are the highest levels in India's entire recorded history. The researchers coined a term for it, the billionaire Raj, and their conclusion was devastating. Today's India is more unequal than it was under British colonial rule. India now has over 917,000 millionaires, with 39,000 added in 2024 alone. But in that same year, average wealth per adult actually declined in real terms. The UBS Global Wealth Report in 2025 ranked India among the 10 most unequal countries on Earth, as unequal as the United States, but without any of the safety nets. Wealth is being created, but only at the very top. For most Indians, that ladder isn't being climbed. It's being pulled away. But this isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This is what happens when a system allocates opportunity based on who you are rather than what you can do. When large sections of a population face barriers to education, professional networks, capital, the entire nation will pay the price. Firms lose talent they never knew existed. Institutions lose the legitimacy that they need to function. And society? Well, it fragments into competing status groups rather than integrating into shared citizenship. And this hierarchy, it doesn't stay within India's borders. In February of 2023, the city of Seattle formally added caste as a protected category in its anti-discrimination law. In California, a major lawsuit against tech giant Cisco alleged caste-based discrimination inside a Silicon Valley workplace. The system adapts, it travels, it persists, even across oceans. But there's one more layer to this, and it's the most uncomfortable one to talk about. Because hierarchy in India isn't only enforced by institutions and social pressure, it's reinforced by something far more personal: belief itself. Now, let's be clear, India's religious and philosophical traditions are among the deepest and most sophisticated in human history. They contain profound moral insight, rich traditions of reform, and powerful internal critique. This is not an attack on anyone's faith, but within those traditions, certain ideas have been recruited, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously, to stabilize the very hierarchy that we've been describing. When suffering is framed as karma, when the moral consequence of actions in a past life, the psychological pressure to fight injustice can weaken. If your misfortune feels deserved, outrage gives way to quiet acceptance. If the social order feels cosmic, challenging it feels dangerous. If duty to your station is sacred, rebellion, it starts to feel like sin. B.R. Ambedkar, the towering intellect who drafted India's constitution, who himself was born into that so-called untouchable Dalit community, saw this with piercing clarity. He argued that the caste system survived not through economic power or political force alone, but through a spiritual architecture that made inequality feel natural, inevitable, even holy. His landmark work, Annihilation of Caste, remains one of the most powerful internal critiques that any civilization has produced against its own foundations. Proof that India has always contained voices demanding change, even as the system has worked to silence them. And the most revealing consequence of the spiritual anchoring? A shift in emotional posture across an entire civilization. Endurance replacing rebellion. A society can endure hardship for a remarkably long time. Endurance can even be mistaken for strength. But endurance has a dark side. When the denial of dignity becomes normal and reform keeps getting deferred, the cost accumulates invisibly until the whole system turns brittle. So here's the question that cuts to the heart of everything. If every society has hierarchy, why does India's version threaten collapse while others produce progress? The answer? is counterweights. Japan is famously hierarchical, but its post-war bureaucracy linked authority directly to performance and institutional discipline. Promotions rewarded competence. Organizations demanded measurable results. The state drove industrial policy with the level of coordination that transformed a devastated nation into an economic superpower within a generation. Hierarchy served a function, and that function was accountable delivery. South Korea is brutally hierarchical, but its social pressure channeled into relentless competition. Through education spending that ranks among the highest in the world, through industry that demanded constant improvement, through a national ambition that treated stagnation as failure. The human cost was enormous. Stress, inequality, a collapsing birth rate, but the system didn't teach people how to endure that station. It taught them to fight their way out of it. And in Western democracies, hierarchy coexists with a deeply rooted culture of challenge. Citizens contest authority through courts, media, unions, and street protest. The result is often messy and sometimes just outright chaotic. But the chaos contains something crucial, a self-correcting mechanism. The power must constantly justify their position or lose it. Hierarchy balanced by accountability produces progress. Hierarchy without accountability produces decay. And India is running out of time to decide which one it chooses, because the world it's entering doesn't wait for societies to get their institutions in order. In 2022 alone, more than 1.7 million Indians died from exposure to air pollution, a 38% increase from just a decade earlier. The economic cost of those premature deaths was estimated at $339 billion, equivalent to 9.5% of India's entire GDP, just wiped out by a single systems problem that demands exactly the kind of institutional coordination that unchallengeable hierarchy makes nearly impossible. Climate stress is intensifying. In 2024, Indians faced 50% more heat wave days than average, resulting in an estimated $194 billion in lost labor productivity. Workers lost roughly 419 hours of labor per person that year, 124% more than in the 90s. Water scarcity is worsening across major agricultural regions. The areas of Indian land experiencing extreme drought, that surged 138% compared to the 1950s. Infrastructure is crumbling not from lack of money, but from lack of accountability in how that money gets spent. These aren't problems that one brilliant engineer or one bold prime minister can solve alone. Air pollution isn't an individual failure. Court backlogs aren't a single judge's fault. Crumbling roads aren't one contractor's corruption. These are systems problems, and systems problems demand exactly what unchallengeable hierarchy destroys: honest feedback, rapid correction, and the ability for ordinary people to stand up and say, "This is unacceptable," without fear. The real question facing India isn't whether it can change its culture overnight. Cultures don't change by command. Civilizations don't abandon 3,000-year-old habits because someone writes a new policy. The real question is whether India can build counterweights, institutions strong enough to hold hierarchy accountable, and social norms brave enough to make challenging power feel legitimate rather than terrifying. Because if unchallengeable hierarchy remains the default, if the habit of tolerating dysfunction continues to shape every courtroom, every government office, every classroom, every workplace, the pattern won't stay a mere inconvenience. A society can survive poverty, it can survive inequality, it can survive even deep internal division. What it cannot survive, not indefinitely, is the slow erosion of institutional trust, the moment when citizens stop believing rules can protect them and start believing only connections, only status, only patient endurance can. That is how nations hollow out, not in one dramatic moment, not in a single catastrophe or foreign invasion, but in a long, quiet unraveling, so gradual that by the time anyone notices, the foundations are already gone. Not with a bang, but with a whisper of resignation that becomes the loudest sound in the room. India has everything it needs to become one of the defining powers of the 21st century. The talent, the scale, the ambition, the democratic framework. But none of that matters if the operating system running underneath it all, the one installed 3,000 years ago, keeps corrupting every institution that it touches. And if this one small thing, this ancient, invisible tolerance for hierarchy that cannot be challenged, isn't confronted soon, it won't just slow India's rise, it will destroy it. So what do you think? Can India break a cycle that's been running for 3,000 years, or is the weight of history just simply too heavy to lift? Let us know in the comments, and if this is the kind of deep, no-holds-barred analysis that you want more of, subscribe to fall of nations. We go where others won't.